Wonderful. So we do just want to offer a short disclaimer that the content of this event is the creation of the presenter, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the TOR TA Center. We will be sending you some follow-up information. We usually send an email out within the next day or so, which will have a link to the recording of this session, handouts of the slides, and a link to our survey, which we'll also put in the chat as we get closer to the end of our session today. But we would encourage you to let us know what you thought of this event today. We really appreciate your feedback, and it really helps us plan what we're doing with our programming going forward. So thanks for taking a couple of minutes to do that for us. Even though we're meeting virtually today, we would like to take a few minutes to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the Indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken over and inhabited. Past and present, we want to honor the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit forever to learn how to be better stewards of these lands through action, advocacy, support, and education. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of the Native American territories, and we respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. While injustices are still being committed against Indigenous people on Turtle Island, today we say thank you to those who stand with Indigenous peoples and acknowledge the land reparations that must be made to allow healing for our Indigenous peoples and to Mother Earth herself. I want to thank the members of our staff who helped write this acknowledgement, Ella and Keely Driscoll and Sean Bear. I do want to remind everyone that we have a link to a technical assistance request form. If you and your program have some needs for assistance in many areas of your program, this is a great opportunity. You can fill out this short form and it will help us understand your needs, and we can put together a task force to help you work on those issues. And that is something that we are here for. We're here to help you solve those problems that you might be having, or questions that you might have, or particular needs. So please take advantage of that, and we would love to be of service. And with that, I realized I had turned my video off. But I want to pass things over to Shirley Kane, who is going to open us up with a blessing before we get started with our presentation today. So thanks again for joining us, and thank you so much, Shirley, for opening us up in a good way.
Oh, miigwech. My name is Shirley Kane. Mashkasi Koyajini Kazo Migazido Dem. It's called Miwizaga in Dunjama. My Shinabe name is Sweetgrass Woman, and I'm from the Eagle Clan, and I'm from Red Lake Nation. And welcome everybody to the webinar, and I know it'll be awesome, and it's in response to some of the grantees who've requested it, to ask, they want more information on methamphetamine and how it affects the brain, and how to help our people and to guide our people into healing. So miigwech. Gishimani do mashkasi koyajini kazo migazido dem. Miigwech Gishimani do for all that you bestow upon us, and special prayers for Nimama Aki, and for all that she bestows upon us, and blessings for all the people here today, and special blessings for all of our people who are working toward health and healing in a good way, and special prayers for our Mother Earth, and for the water that we have, and that we always have good water and clean water for this generation and for all the generations to come. Miigwech for all the healing and the goodness and the people who are helping other people in any way. Special prayers for all the people who are in treatment centers and incarcerated, or homeless, or in dire situations. And miigwech to all of the helpers that we have in our communities, and miigwech for all of the people on this call, and the presenter, miigwech for her, and for all of our people and part of our team. So what I want to do, Miigwech, I want to also sing a short song to honor our water and to acknowledge that our water will always be clean. And it's the water song. I call it the water song. Nihibe gizagegu gimi kwechawe nimigu gijawe nimigu Nihibe gizagegu gimi kwechawe nimigu gijawe nimigu Nihibe gizagegu gimi kwechawe nimigu gijawe nimigu Nihibe gizagegu gimi kwechawe nimigu gijawe nimigu. Woo, woo, Miigwech. Dr. Campopiano, take it away.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Kate. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm going to take just a quick second and get my slides up on the screen so you can see them. And then I'm also going to go off camera while I'm presenting, mostly so I don't have to look at myself, but I'll be back. Let's see. I think I've got everything set up here. These are our learning objectives for this activity together. As a result of this session, it's my hope, if I'm successful, that you will be better able to connect the behaviors of people with substance use disorder to what's happening in their brains. And you'll be familiar with current and developing treatment options for methamphetamine. And you'll be able to describe the relationship between opioids, stimulants, and overdose. And you'll understand the connection between stimulants and psychosis. So that's our task together. Now, let's see if I can get where I can steer. Talking about addiction can be discouraging and bring up a lot of painful feelings. So I like to start on a positive note and take a moment to remember that people do recover from addiction. Recovery from addiction is a process of putting yourself together again into a beautiful whole. And this means being personally healthy, having a home, a place to belong, a purpose, something meaningful to be engaged in, being part of a community and part of a culture. Native peoples have known forever that culture is important to wellness, and this type of thinking is finally starting to spread to other communities with a great benefit to many people, including people with addiction. So this is the cycle of substance use that becomes the cycle of addiction for some people. It's a process that goes through phases. Binge and intoxication, which is the time when people are high or drunk or impaired, followed by a period of withdrawal, or what we call negative affect, which is bad mood, anger, sadness, all sorts of bad feelings. After this comes a preoccupation and anticipation phase. This is when people are thinking almost exclusively about how and when they're going to be able to use drugs again. And their behavior and activities are directed at accomplishing that. So in a lot of people's experience who don't necessarily have addiction, you see people who have a habit of going out with friends on Friday after work or Saturday, and they consume alcohol and they become intoxicated. And then Sunday or Monday, they don't feel very good. They feel a little sick, maybe a little even on Tuesday. Middle of the week, it's all about, boy, I can't wait until happy hour on Friday again. So that's a little story that's a common experience for some people that describes the phases of substance use that become addiction for some people. Another little mini version can be like you have your cigarette and then you have to go back in the office where they don't let you smoke, and you start to feel a little uncomfortable and maybe a little grumpy, and you start thinking about, when can I go out for my cigarette again? So that's the cycle that I'm talking about. And this is a cycle that takes over for people with addiction. Addiction, regardless of the substance or behavior that we're talking about, happens in the same three parts of our brains. And these are the basal ganglia, the extended amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. Now, you don't need to be worried about the names of these things. The names are not that important, but it's helpful to know, kind of what the landscape is of what we're talking about. So regardless of whether it's opioids or methamphetamine or alcohol, these are the same three parts of the brain that are involved in those three phases of the addiction process. Now, what is the job of these three parts of the brain? Everything in the brain has a purpose, and so do these parts. These structures are parts of the brain. Their purpose is to help us interpret our experiences, decide what they mean, and make decisions about whether to repeat the experiences. So a little tiny example would be when you eat your favorite sweet treat. You recognize that that's pleasurable. Maybe even it means things like it reminds you of your grandmother who used to cook it for you or something. So it has meaning. And your brain goes, this is good. I'm going to label this as a positive experience. But then there's a decision-making step. And you might think your brain would just automatically say, let's do that again. But not always, because your sweet treat, if you eat too much of it, may make you sick, or it may make your blood sugar go up or something. So the decision-making part of the brain is the part that sorts out what's pleasant, what's meaningful, and how to act on the information. So all three of those pieces are happening. Another example would be like changing a dirty diaper. It's not a very pleasant experience. It can be quite smelly and messy, but it is a positive thing to do because the baby needs it done. The baby is now comfortable and happy again. And the decision is going to be, I'm going to repeat the unpleasant experience because it's the good thing to do. So those are little mini cycles of what's going on in those three parts of the brain and what their job is in terms of day-to-day life. Now, these are the exact same three parts of the brain that are altered by trauma. So personal trauma, historical trauma, it impacts the function of these parts of the brain. So that's an important context to have when you're interacting with somebody who's demonstrating some one of these phases of the addiction process, is what might trauma have already done to these parts of the brain. So this is how the addiction process, the drug use cycle maps onto these parts. The basal ganglia, which is what you use to learn routine behaviors and experience rewards, is the binge intoxication part. Okay, the extended amygdala, which is what regulates your reactions to stress, says this is a good stress or a bad stress, is the part that is involved in the withdrawal, negative affect, sort of hangover part of substance use and addiction. And the third part, the prefrontal cortex, is the decision-making part. It sets your priorities and organizes you and helps you regulate your impulses. This is the part that is misfunctioning during the preoccupation anticipation phase. Now, I'm going to walk through these again a little bit, but our presentation today is about brain chemistry. So I need to tell you what the chemicals are that are carrying the messages between the different parts of the brain and ultimately controlling how they function. So dopamine and opioid peptides are two of the important chemicals in the brain that have to do with experiencing pleasure or relief or basically quote unquote good feelings. Norepinephrine, corticotropin releasing factor, dynorphin, and glutamate are all chemicals that have to do with action and stress and energy activation. Now, I put a little check mark on the slide here next to opioid peptides because I wanted to make sure that you were aware and that I pointed out for you that opioids, that drug that people abuse when it comes in a pill or heroin, is a substance that is also made by your brain. So this is a naturally occurring chemical that is part of normal brain function. And this lends a little interesting complication to addiction and how it looks when people are using different substances. So I'm kind of flagging that for your attention as we go through. So the chemicals are the ways that the brain sends messages around to the different parts and coordinates the function. Now, disturbing the chemistry. So when you ingest a substance, if I have a drink of alcohol or somebody uses another drug and they experience intoxication, that's because you have disturbed your chemistry sort of acutely, like you've just suddenly added something else to the mix and stirred it up and now the chemicals are not right. And that alters the function and produces the behaviors that we see people doing when they're high or intoxicated. And if you keep repeating that cycle, the brain will adapt so that normal function becomes harder to do. And if you're a young person and your brain is still developing, you may actually change the structure of those parts of your brains permanently because they were growing, their environment got messed up, and so they grew a little bit wrong. And that doesn't mean that people who start using substances when they're young can't recover. It just means they may need extra help for a longer time, and it may take more effort. So I want to make the same connection here for you for the person with trauma. So if those structures of your brain were affected by trauma, and then you start on this cycle or process of substance use and addiction, your brain might be more susceptible to getting off track, to the cycle of your behavior control going out of whack, and need more help and more support to stay in the right direction and doing the right things. And I'm going to go through here next, kind of step by step, how these things look. But I want to take our first little pause just right now and see if there are any questions or comments before I start kind of going through each one at a time.
Yes, feel free to unmute if you have any questions at all. And if you guys want to put any questions or comments in the chat, I'd also be happy to read them off if you're not able to unmute yourself.
So I don't mind a little awkward silence here for just a minute while you think about whether you want to ask a question now or maybe wait. But I will stop again. So if you're thinking about it or you're not sure, don't worry, this is not your only opportunity. So it doesn't look to me like anybody has unmuted. So I'm going to carry on with the presentation. So right here, I want to just acknowledge that when we talk about stimulants, the whole category is meant to encompass methamphetamine, amphetamine, etc., and cocaine. But for today's session, we're primarily focusing on methamphetamine because it's my understanding that that is the biggest challenge in your communities. But what are the differences? And then we're going to move on from this. So the key differences are, of course, methamphetamine is completely man-made chemical. It's not derived from a plant. It produces a very long-lasting high if it's smoked, whereas cocaine is a very brief high when it's smoked. 50% of it is still in your body after 12 hours, whereas with cocaine, 50% of it is gone in an hour. Methamphetamine does two different kind of things to the dopamine, the chemical dopamine in your brain. It causes the brain cells to release it, and it makes the dopamine stay in circulation. Cocaine only makes it stay in circulation. It's a little bit different, and that's part of why it's more intense and lasts longer. Now, both of them have some limited use in medicine. If you've ever had Novocaine from the dentist or lidocaine for a small procedure, those were originally derived from cocaine, although they're made from chemicals now. And methamphetamine is chemically related to some of the medications that we prescribe for ADHD, narcolepsy, and weight loss. So from here on, unless I say otherwise, I'm really only talking about methamphetamine, but I just kind of wanted to cover that so you would know. So we're going to walk through the phases and functions of the brain and look at what's happening when somebody uses methamphetamine. So the basal ganglia is where we experience rewards. We learn the routine behaviors, the behaviors we do without thinking about it, or habits, things that we can do without really having to pay attention or remind ourselves. Now, in addiction, the way the basal ganglia is involved is this is the binge intoxication phase. So initially, people feel either pleasure from the drug that they use, or they get relief from unpleasant feelings. Sometimes people are using drugs because they need to escape from a distressing situation or feelings. So they get pleasure or they get relief. But the basal ganglia, while it's making a note of this positive experience of relief or pleasure, it's also kind of plugging in all the people and the places and the things related with this drug use experience and programming an automatic habit to take place. This makes drug use as familiar and as routine as brushing your teeth, putting your car keys in your pocket when you get out of the car. So That's what this part of the brain is doing in addiction. Now, when people are using a substance, what's happening chemically is they're getting a big dopamine release with methamphetamine. So this is the chemical that says, you know, fireworks, yay, hooray. It's a very positive feeling, or it erases a negative feeling. And it's very intense with initial substance use, although your body kind of turns the volume down on it as time goes by, and the ability to feel pleasure from the drug decreases. But people still have learned, because the basal ganglia has created a habit or a program, that I might feel that pleasure or relief again from this drug. Okay, so you've got a pattern that's been learned, that's programmed into the basal ganglia. Now, opioid peptides are also involved even when people don't use an opioid, because they're a part of the reward and pleasure pathway. The other chemical that starts happening in the basal ganglia is glutamine. And glutamine is the, hey, this is important, pay attention chemical. So it's the one that's saying, remember this, this is a habit you want to form now and do without thinking about it. Now, opioids, because our brains make opioid peptides, when we take an opioid, whatever it might be, a pill or heroin or something, it directly does the job of the opioid peptides. It also indirectly releases dopamine. So you're still getting the dopamine and you still get the body going, turning down the volume on dopamine. Opioids tend to make people feel sort of peaceful, relaxed. They relieves pain, it relieves emotional distress. So during the binge intoxication phase, people are fairly, you know, subdued for the most part. During stimulants, you get this, or methamphetamine in particular, you get this boom release of dopamine that stays out running around, communicating in the brain, but you also indirectly release opioids. And this can be a little bit why people seem like kind of indestructible when they're high on methamphetamine, is they're just not processing physical feelings the same way. They experience a feeling of intense energy, strength, confidence, capability. They are distracted from boredom or frustration, but it can go overboard into just out of control anger and even psychosis. And I'm going to talk about psychosis a little bit more later, and how that's different from just being just quote unquote high on methamphetamine. So the binge intoxication phase is really prominent in stimulant misuse because of the dopamine release being so big. All drugs, both of these drugs and all drugs, basically train this part of the brain to go, make a note of this experience because we're going to do it again. So that's the contribution here of the basal ganglia. Now, I have a little, like, this is the same information, but I want to make sure and highlight some differences here. I already mentioned the very prominent phase of binge intoxication stimulant use. This is when people are really doing the behaviors that are causing problems for people around them and getting them hurt. And then the contrast between stimulants directly release dopamine and keep it in circulation, but indirectly release some opioid peptides too. And opioids do the exact opposite. They directly replace the opioid peptide function and indirectly release some dopamine. So that's part of why people look so different, even though the same three parts of the brain are what's working in this addiction. Now, moving on to the next phase and the next part of the brain, the extended amygdala with the withdrawal, negative affect, kind of hangover phase. The extended amygdala is what labels your experience. So it regulates your reaction to stress. Like some stress, like, you know, I always feel a little stressed when I'm going to make a presentation to people, but it's a good stress because it makes me prepare and work hard. Other kinds of bad stress would be like things that make you so stressed out you can't function. So my amygdala is going, this is okay stress. You don't need to escape from this stress. You need to use this stress. So it goes in and labels this a good thing to repeat, bad thing not to do again. And then this is what is going to connect it to your ability to make decisions. So what's happening here is the habit, reward, and decision-making process is getting interrupted right here, because this emotional part of the brain is starting to mislabel things. Okay, now let's look at what that is like when people, more specifically when people are using drugs. So without the substance, with the substance, they feel relief from a negative feeling, or they might feel pleasure. Without it, they feel sick, sometimes physically sick, sometimes just not good inside their own skin. It's just a very uncomfortable feeling. They will generally look at things in a very negative way. They may be sad, they may be angry. They may feel like everything is just boring and not worth the effort, even things that they used to really love or that were important to them. This is happening because of the changes, chemical changes in the extended amygdala is very active during substance use, creating feelings of stress, sadness, and anger using corticotropin releasing factor, glutamate, and dynorphin. These are all very high levels during this withdrawal negative affect phase, and it's disrupting that connection. The reward system, the part about feeling pleasure when you do something and you feel pleasure, becomes less important because it actually becomes harder to feel pleasure because you don't have as much dopamine. Okay, so this is interrupting that thing. So things that you might otherwise do because they're the right thing to do and they're fun. You might be at somebody's birthday party and you might look like, you know, somebody ran over your dog. It's because you don't have any dopamine. You're there because you got yourself there. You want to be there. It's the place to be, but you can't generate a happy feeling and you can't look happy. Makes you look really disengaged from the experience, and people will notice that you don't seem to be having the expected social appearance. And that's because of what's happening here with these chemicals in the extended amygdala. Now, in opioid use, this phase is when people are just really sick, sweating and twitching and in pain and vomiting and all that. We often get distracted by all those symptoms and tend to see more like, and tend not to see just how profoundly sad and hopeless people are during this phase because they're just so sick. All that stuff is very obvious. The desire to avoid this experience is really prominent. This is actually more prominent in opioid use disorder than the binge intoxication phase is. This is kind of what drives the cycle, as people really want to not feel like this. And so even when the opioids aren't giving them any pleasurable feeling, they continue using them because they're trying to get out of this withdrawal negative affect phase that their extended amygdala has happened. Now in stimulants, this will be kind of the crash period. People have had a run of use and this is when they just completely collapse and they're asleep and they're crabby and they don't care about anything. Every little tiny activity, even eating, is overwhelming. They're angry because they have too much glutamate. They have zero motivation to do even life-sustaining things, take care of their children, eat, get up and use the bathroom. They don't even have enough dopamine to do normal hygienic things, wash themselves. That's how like zeroed out this phase is chemically and in terms of the structure. So this is just reminding me to make sure that I covered all these points. This phase really drives the cycle and the process of addiction in opiates. This can be a very damaging unhealthy place associated with a lot of not socially productive, not personally healthy behaviors for people with methamphetamine. And it can be very, very difficult to get them out of this phase, which is why they may drag themselves along feeling miserable and trying to do things for weeks before they give in and use again. So this can be a very difficult place to get out of without resorting to stimulants, but it's not as big a driver as the withdrawal from opioids is. Now I'm going to go through this last phase and part of the brain, and then I'm going to pause for this, check for questions and whatnot again. So we've come around the cycle to the prefrontal cortex, which handles preoccupation and anticipation. Now, this part of the brain, its job is what we call executive function. This is the boss of the brain. This is where the decisions get made, things get organized, activities get planned, tasks get prioritized. This is where those impulses that teenagers so often have trouble with get shut down when it's working properly. So teenagers act on their impulses a lot because this part of their brain hasn't fully developed. When you're grown, theoretically, at least, ideally, if the prefrontal cortex is working properly, this is the one that even though you're feeling really angry, this is what stops you from saying the angry thing that pops into your head. And this is the one that keeps you from acting on an impulse that you know would be destructive. Okay, so this is the decision maker. This is the risk-benefit analysis part of the brain. And in a person with addiction, this has been completely hijacked by that habit-forming part of the brain and that angry, negative, disconnected part of the brain. So this actually makes you not care as much about duty, obligation, caution, safety, and says, act on that impulse, go right ahead. You can do it one more time. The ability to stop, think, make decisions is it's just not there. This is like the brakes part of your car, and now your car is kind of out of control. And the acting on impulse just overpowers your brakes. So during this phase, what people are going through is they're becoming obsessed really with getting the drug. They convince themselves that they can use it again, that it will make them feel better, that the bad things won't happen this time. They're looking forward to it. Sometimes, like an example I'll share from my clinical experiences, I took care of pregnant women, and they would get through their pregnancy without using drugs, but they did not know how to celebrate successfully getting through their pregnancy and delivering the baby except by using drugs. So they would spend the whole pregnancy looking forward to delivering the baby so they could use drugs. And we wouldn't necessarily know to think about or worry about this process unless we think about what's going on in the brain. Because this cycle of binge intoxication, withdrawal, preoccupation can go very fast from one drug using episode to the next, or it can go really slowly. And you can be in this preoccupation phase, and this happens a lot when people socially isolate. One way that people stop using drugs is to cut themselves off from all the people they used with. And so they've protected themselves from triggers, but they're basically kind of hibernating or stuck in this preoccupation anticipation phase. And they're just avoiding the opportunity to make the bad decision, but they haven't stopped making bad decisions. So what's gone on here is your extended amygdala sending out really strong signals. Your prefrontal cortex has potentially shrunk and become less effective and more sensitive to these stress signals. So, you know, people who went through wars, you know, they're tough, they can handle stress. And then they get addiction and suddenly their brain chemistry has changed. So the stress signals that their extended amygdala is sending them because of their addiction, the prefrontal cortex can't stop it. It can't block it. It's gotten weakened. So it's changed. Things they used to be able to do, they can't necessarily do anymore. Now, in quickly comparing opioids and stimulants again, this preoccupation anticipation phase is more similar than different. Stimulants perhaps have a more intense drive to use, whereas opioids continue to stay in this more like, I need to escape miserableness. But both will kind of rationalize using their drug in order to function. I just want to feel normal, they'll say. And they're very, very sensitive to cues and triggers, which is why people so often, early recovery, they isolate themselves because they have zero ability to withstand triggers. So they shut themselves in the house and they don't talk to anybody or see anybody. Now, so that's the main difference between these two is opioids kind of have almost more of a panic, and stimulants create more like this obsessive single-mindedness to pursue the drugs. It's less clear exactly what the chemical imbalance is. It's more the cumulative effect of chemical changes in the basal ganglia and the extended amygdala. So it's like a snowball effect. Now, this is a little summary slide, so it gives me an opportunity to stop again and see if anyone has put in any questions or wants to ask a question.
Melinda, this is Pam. I see somebody has asked if you can describe what happens when someone is tweaking on meth.
I can. Yes, thank you for that question. Now, tweaking is not a medical term. So different people mean different things when they say tweaking. And the way I have come to understand what people mean when they say someone is tweaking is that it's beyond being just intoxicated. So when you're intoxicated, you've got all this dopamine swimming around and you've got your opioid peptides released, but you also have all the other chemicals causing this agitation. And tweaking is like kind of being on the verge of psychosis. And the difference between being high and being psychotic is your ability to test reality. A lot of people on methamphetamine, when they're intoxicated or high, they don't seem like they're in touch with reality because their just behavior is just bizarre for us looking from the outside in. But they can still tell when there's, and I'll give you a little story that might help. And this is this is my sister. Okay, my sister's in recovery from methamphetamine. And she told me this story about herself. She had this car and it had really nice stereo system in it. And one day the stereo quit working and she had noticed that there might be a fuse out in the dashboard. So she, for something else, one of the other lights wasn't working. And so she thought, well, I'm just going to get in there. I'm going to replace, she's pretty handy. She went in there and she replaced the fuses and still it wasn't working. So then she's like, oh, you know, the stereo thing must be broken on, I'll install a new one myself. And so she did all that. And so she's doing all these tasks that are kind of complicated. She's running to the auto parts store and she's coming back and she finally decides, okay, I'm gonna have to pull out the dash because it's clearly this other problem. You know, I don't even know enough about electronics in a car to fully understand what all she did, but she pulls out the dash, which is like a big deal. And she's high this whole time because she's on methamphetamine. So she's doing all this stuff and she looks kind of crazy from the outside, but she's not psychotic, because what happened is, and she realized this later, is somebody had stolen the speakers. So that's the kind of thing that somebody will do when they're high, is they just are not able to detect all of the relevant information from their environment to make decisions. They're walking through steps and doing tasks. They may be driving down the road or, you know, operating machinery or doing whatever, but they're not disconnected from reality. They're just not able to observe and process everything in their reality. Somebody who has gone to tweaking and past tweaking into psychosis is somebody who's like hearing things that aren't there, feeling things that aren't real, and so on. People who are intoxicated on methamphetamine, they will argue all kind of nonsense with you, but they're not going to be hearing things that aren't really there. So I'm going to talk more about psychosis, and I hope that that will further elaborate this kind of where's the line between being intoxicated and being psychotic. I'm going to carry on with the presentation right now, if that's okay, unless there's another related question. So this is a little summary slide of kind of the differences between stimulants and opioids. So you've got very prominent binge intoxication. Methamphetamine, which I'm using the abbreviation MA here, stays in the body for a long time. It's generally longer acting than most opioids. Directly releases dopamine and keeps it in circulation, and indirectly releases opioid peptides, which is the opposite of opioids. It makes it so there's just not enough dopamine anymore. Your body kind of turns the volume down, turns down the manufacturing of dopamine, and it causes a lot of glutamate, which causes a lot of emotional instability and irritability. Now, there's some stuff that we can learn if we think about treatment for these two conditions. We can learn a little bit about why some things we try to do work and why some things don't. So the big difference with, excuse me, I'm going to drink a little bit of water. Is, you know, we don't have a dopamine pill. And so we have opioids occur naturally in the brain, and we can replace the opioid deficit with medication and stabilize that process or cycle, get people on who are addicted to opioids out of the cycle, interrupt it, and let them start to restore normal brain function over time. We don't have the ability to do that with stimulants. And it's partly because opioids were sort of fixing, if you will, the withdrawal negative affect phase. And you can't really do that exactly with stimulants, because stimulants are really more driven by the binge intoxication phase. And we don't have a stimulant that's safe to use widely that can cause a slow, long-acting effect. So it's partly the drive, what's driving the cycle of addiction in these two substances for why we have a medication that works for one and not for the other. And it's also just that opioids occur naturally in the brain. And we don't have a dopamine pill. And that's a little bit what I talk about here also. But remember Methamphetamine releases dopamine directly, but it also indirectly releases opioids. And that's why it's possible, there are some early studies going on with extended release injectable naltrexone and buprenorphine that suggests that they may be able to help a little bit with stimulant disorder. One of the things that if you treat people with opioid use disorder with medication, obviously you're going to have a lot of people who also use stimulants. And you'll notice that at least some of them will start to be able to control their stimulant use disorder a little bit while they're on medication for their opioid use disorder. Now, they have to be able to get enough behavioral support at the same time, but people have observed in treating opioid use disorder among people who also use stimulants, sometimes their stimulant use disorder gets a little more controlled, and over time, if you treat them long enough, may stop. So they're actually studying these drugs to see through this mechanism of helping with the indirect release of opioids that stimulants cause, whether these can help stabilize the brain chemistry of people who use stimulants. They'll never quite be used exactly the same way that we use them for opioids, but there's some potential here. And this is the overlap that accounts for that. And again, there is no dopamine pill. We have, however, antidepressants that can help your brain cells produce and release dopamine. So to some extent, antidepressants can help the withdrawal negative affect phase of the addiction process. It gives a little bit of a boost to the dopamine so that people can feel motivated and be able to feel pleasure from normal activities again. So that's the other difference. Now, there are medications that are also potentially targeting glutamate. Glutamate is the chemical that causes irritability. And that's emotional irritability, but also brain cell irritability. And one of them is Topamax or topiramate. If you've heard of it, it's an anti-seizure drug. It's being studied. There is not enough evidence to say whether it's going to work or whether we'll ever be able to use it to help people with stimulant use disorder. But the theory is that it can help stabilize the brain chemistry so that your prefrontal cortex can get the upper hand on the decision making again. Now, there have been some studies with stimulant medications, like long-acting stimulant medications. If we give that to somebody who uses stimulants, wouldn't that work the same way giving an opioid to somebody who uses opioids work? And unfortunately, so far they have not reliably helped people not use drugs or help them function better, which is unfortunate. Studies are still going on to see if there's a specific type of chemical or stimulant or combination or dosing schedule that might work. But it doesn't so far look like it, even though it makes sense on some kind of level. It's not ready for prime time at all. Now, there are some therapies in development that, again, are not something that we can order or offer in our programs, but they're out there. One is the transcranial magnetic stimulation. And a few years ago, NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, wasn't even like ready to acknowledge this. And now you can find stuff about it on their website. So the research has built up enough to think that it's promising enough that this might turn into a clinical therapy. but it's still probably some years away. The next thing is neurofeedback, which is a lot like biofeedback, like from the 70s. But it uses a graphical display, like on a screen, of your brain electrical activity to help people regulate their emotions and thoughts in response to what they're seeing on the screen. It seems like it helps people visualize and relearn different reactions to their emotions and relabel some of their experiences as far as good stresses and bad stresses. Now, vaccines that cause the body to produce antibodies that block methamphetamine, this is being researched. This is very far from being available for clinical use, and is something I think they might be getting a little closer to something like this for cocaine than they are methamphetamine. But it's out there, and it's something that we're keeping an eye on, and you can learn more about them at the link on this slide. Now, we do know about psychosocial treatments that work well for stimulants, and these are the contingency management and the matrix model, also called the trust model now. Matrix model you may be familiar with. It's kind of a package, a framework of therapy sessions that include a teacher kind of coach relationship, positive encouragement, and reinforcement for positive behavior change. This is being updated based on newer research, and it's now being called trust. And you can find some manuals for like how it's to be used in clinical settings at this link here in the bottom of the screen. Now, contingency management is a process of rewarding the desired behaviors. So coming to your appointments, having negative toxicology screens. So you reward the behaviors you want instead of punishing behaviors. The addiction itself is kind of enough punishment for the behaviors, and it hasn't been enough to change people's behaviors. So this takes the opposite approach, that you reward the behaviors you want people to have. And it uses prizes that need to be meaningful to the person. So they don't have to be material things, and they should obviously be culturally appropriate. It shouldn't, you don't want to give things of huge monetary value, but something that has a positive association, is personally meaningful. And the more behaviors the person exhibits, the more positive behaviors in a row, the greater the reward, or the more frequent the reward. So that's, again, it's retraining that basal ganglia, that reward and habit part of the brain. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a little bit like talking therapy. It's like talking people through, you made a decision and it was a bad decision, and how do you recognize that now, and how would you cope with that situation differently, and what can we plan in advance to help you avoid this trigger. So it's really about thinking through your behaviors and planning for changes. And then 12-step facilitation has a good evidence base. This is basically a professionally facilitated group that runs a lot like a 12-step program, but it really focuses on step one of the program, which is sort of accepting that you don't have control over the disease. And one of the goals is to help people engage with 12-step in their communities so that they have a lasting support for their recovery moving forward. A lot of people will go to 12-step in the community and engage in 12-step at their program as well. Now, I'm going to stop before I talk a little bit about overdose, and then we're going to revisit psychosis, but I want to pause here and just check for questions.
Yeah, we had a few questions. So when we were talking about the definition of tweaking, you said that they may just not be absorbing all of the information from their environment. Someone's asked, does this apply to traumatic brain injury and trauma? Like, are those conditions kind of similar?
That's a good question. Let me try to answer that. So they're different in as much as it's not triggered by substance use. It's triggered by something else, the historical trauma or the personal trauma, but the same parts of the brain are involved. So the habits, the negative feelings, the disconnect, the sort of mislabeling of experience between positive stress, negative stress, and the disconnect with decision making. That's going on in PTSD as well. It's kind of like the trauma short circuits the healthy decision making and puts the person on a cycle of avoiding triggers to their trauma, reacting to triggers of their trauma, suffering the emotional fallout of that, and then trying to regroup or recover from it and function. And what can happen is a person with trauma, if they don't get help functioning again and feeling safe again, is that they become more and more withdrawn, and they have more and more unhealthy ways of coping with the distressing feelings and the situations that trigger it. So it's an unhealthy spiral as they cycle through the trauma again. But when you're in that sort of intoxication phase, the extended amygdala withdrawal, negative affect phase, you're not processing everything that's going on around you very well, and you're not reacting. Your emotions are like magnified as you're reacting to things, or you may be reacting in a wrong way. I mean, a really obvious example is you hear a loud noise and you hit the ground. And that would be a perfectly healthy example if you're in a war zone, but it's not probably a healthy way to react to a loud noise in your backyard. Okay, but that's your extended amygdala firing off, and your prefrontal cortex is saying hit the ground because it's been overrun by this other part of your brain. So there's similarities and differences.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
We had another comment. Tweaking is most commonly what addicts call using meth for a prolonged period where their behavior is based on maintaining the meth high at all costs.
Thank you for
And
that.
then we had a question. I heard that, sorry if I say this wrong, baclofen can help with the trigger to use.
Baclofen it's a psychotropic drug, which means it has effects on the brain. It calms, it's used for like spasticity. So like if your muscles are jerky or stiff, it relaxes them. So you can think of it as calming the nervous system. So it's in that category of turning down the glutamate. I think the example I gave was topiramate or Topamax. So baclofen is in that same sort of general category. It has not been really carefully studied. It's on the market because it's used for different things, but it hasn't been conclusively shown to be of benefit to people with stimulant use disorder. It might help, it might not, maybe it has unintended consequences. It just hasn't been studied, so there's some unanswered questions. Was
Awesome.
there?
I don't think we don't have any other questions at the moment.
Okay. Well, I think that I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about the horrible increase in overdose mortality that was very much exacerbated by COVID and the isolation and social disruption that resulted from it. I do want to acknowledge the disproportionate impact this has had on Native communities in the United States. Non-Hispanic, American Indian, Native American rates of death 3 times higher than the US average in 2011. And deaths involving methamphetamine quadrupled in the last decade. And then you put what happened during COVID on top of that. This is the more recent COVID period here at the end, the far right-hand side of the graph. This is stimulant use related deaths. And what's happening here is not so much that stimulants have become more deadly. It's just that methamphetamine in particular is now contaminated to a large extent by fentanyl. And fentanyl is, of course, the opioid that causes very rapid death after it's been ingested. This is what's causing the high rates of opioid overdose as well. So here you have people who are not even looking to use opioids. They're looking to use stimulants, and they're dying of opioid overdose because the chemical substance they're being sold, that probably is methamphetamine, also has fentanyl in it. So the main difference from the point of view of community and programmatic responses is to make sure that the people that are using methamphetamine in your community are being reached by your overdose prevention, education, and naloxone programs, because they should have access to naloxone in case they experience an overdose death or an overdose related to fentanyl being present in the methamphetamine. Is they have no opioid tolerance either, so they need to have the antidote available. So that's very concisely the overdose situation. The take-home message is people need access to naloxone when, even if they aren't identified as people who are seeking to misuse opioids. Now, methamphetamine and mental health. We mentioned that depletion of dopamine that happens in the brain that actually interferes with people being able to experience kind of modest happiness at normal occasions, a child's birthday party, one's mother's birthday party, etc. This depletion of dopamine can and does cause depression in people who use opioid or stimulants. The experience of using stimulants, much like trauma, can cause development of anxiety as well. People with depression or anxiety are at higher risk of developing substance use disorders of any kind as well. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. Sometimes it comes first and makes people more vulnerable to addiction, and sometimes it's caused by the changes related that happen in the brain from addiction or the experiences one has while one has addiction. Very severe depression can cause psychosis, which I said is losing touch with reality, not being able to distinguish real things from not real things. But psychosis is also something that people who use stimulants can experience. As many as 40% of people who use stimulants will experience psychosis. Psychosis consists of hearing and feeling things that aren't there. You may hear people talking to you or noises. People can tear open the walls of the house because they think there are mice in there because they're hearing things that aren't there. They can spray chemicals all over the place because they are convinced there are bugs crawling on them and that their house must be infested. They get what's called ideas of reference, which means you might overhear a conversation about something or on television, something completely unrelated to you, and become convinced that they were telling you to do what they were talking about. And that can cause some strange behavior. Paranoia, which is not just like suspiciousness or fear of people, but actually becoming absolutely convinced that people are trying to hurt you. That the driver that pulled out in front of you did it on purpose and is trying to kill you. So you get really extreme reactions. You can see repetitive movements. The picking is one of them, but picking is also because people are feeling things that aren't there. Pacing, going out the door, coming back in, going out, walking around the yard, coming back in over and over again. And very easy to become violent. So difficult to try to calm people down because it tends to provoke them a little bit. Most people who experience psychosis do get better within a week or so of stopping use with supportive therapy, supportive interventions that promote their safety, and psychosocial treatments that help them process the feelings and experiences that they're having. Symptoms that last more than a month or come back without stimulant use may be an indication that a person has developed a psychotic disorder and should have psychiatric evaluation. And this is where kind of the line between tweaking, being intoxicated, tweaking, and becoming psychotic is a little fuzzy, because the larger the amounts of use, the longer the use, the higher the risk of psychosis. Frequent small amounts is also associated with a higher rate of psychosis, but it's usually larger, longer use, and beginning at an earlier age. And that's probably more to do with changes to the brain. Whoopsie. There we go. What do you do with psychosis when you think it's happening? Main thing is to keep them safe and hydrated. As long as they're not a danger to themselves or someone else, they don't necessarily need to be, committed or otherwise isolated. Antipsychotic medications like Seroquel, quetiapine work for methamphetamine-induced psychosis. Other things like benzodiazepines can help people calm down while the psychosis is wearing off, even though it doesn't really treat the psychosis itself. The challenge, of course, I don't need to tell you this, is that family and friends can be very frightened by the psychotic behavior. Law enforcement may be called to try to help, but they're not usually very well equipped to deal with mental health emergencies. They're not trained for that. And they may because of the command and control type of approach to policing, they may actually make the situation worse. Emergency departments are not necessarily a great solution for MA-induced psychosis. Often they're too far away to be useful, and they're not usually, unless it's a psychiatric emergency department, they're not going to be very well set up for people having a psychiatric crisis. They often make the agitation worse because of noise and just activity and people bustling around. So I want to share with you, this was the result of a methamphetamine task force, community task force, and they made multiple recommendations. But the one recommendation they made that I wanted to point out to you, now that we're coming out of COVID, it might be a little more feasible, was to have a trauma-informed sobering site that integrated some harm reduction services so that people who were having erratic behavior or behavior that was just not acceptable to their families, or they needed to be kept safe for a while until they could be transported to a medical place, could have sort of a community drop-in center, if you will, a safe place where people are not going to be re-traumatized and can get something to eat or drink and just stay safe until their symptoms settle down. And this can be a sort of an intermediate place between the community and having one's family have to manage a loved one until the drug wears off, and or having to go to a psychiatric emergency service of some kind. In this way, people can become connected to services that will improve health outcomes. Now, this may not be the right approach for your community, and I would direct you to the report more in the interest of having you see if maybe their community task force decision-making process might be useful to you, and you could think through with other stakeholders in your tribe or your nation what might be some strategies. You might come up with some of the same ideas, or you might adjust them so they're more culturally appropriate, or you might come up with completely different ideas that are unique to your community and your needs. So that was the one little thing I wanted to suggest with regard to psychosis and sobering. So this is my little summary slide. That addiction is the same process for all substances. Trauma impacts the same parts of the brain where addiction happens and can make the risk for addiction higher and the recovery from addiction more challenging. There are not yet medications specifically approved for treatment of methamphetamine use disorder. There are effective psychosocial treatments with a good evidence base, so you know you're not going to be inadvertently harming someone. People who use methamphetamine need naloxone because most of the methamphetamine overdose deaths are because of fentanyl in the methamphetamine. Psychosis is common among people who use methamphetamine, especially for long periods of time or at large doses, and responds to treatment and conservative management. A safe, quiet place in the community may be a good way to help people who may be having some symptoms of psychosis. And I think I've got, no, I don't. Okay, we'll keep this one up unless you want me to stop sharing. I could stop sharing and come back on camera maybe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campopiano. looks like we have, yeah, I wanted to just make sure we get a few times, let you know that you have a few more minutes for questions. So please keep submitting your question. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you want to jump in and ask a question. But yeah, I think you can go ahead and keep these slides up if you would like to. Sometimes people might have questions if we want to go back and look at something quickly. We can do that too.
Okay, I'll keep the slides. Oops, I'll keep the slides up and I'll come back on camera so I can see people a little and they can see me again. We'll see if there's, I'm gonna get the little box with all of your faces and stuff over here where I can see you.
Yeah, we have had a couple of comments and questions since the last break. Question here, can extended use actually cause severe brain damage?
Extended use shouldn't, it will cause changes to the brain. As a physician, I wouldn't label it brain damage. That means something specific to me, but it will definitely change the structures of your brain. Your prefrontal cortex will be smaller, for example. So it changes the brain. Now, it's more concerning when that happens during adolescence, because if your addiction happens when you're an adult and your brain is changed, but it developed normally to start with, sometimes after a period of recovery, your brain will kind of restore itself and look more normal, if not completely normal again. But when you're a child or an adolescent and you're using and your brain never develops properly to start with, then that can have lasting consequences for your ability to recover and to function in life. Me not wanting to call it brain damage is maybe just a little splitting hairs, but it has real impact on the brain. And the amount of impact is dose related, so amount and duration of use, but also age related.
Dr. Campopiano, it's Pam. Thank you for all this, by the way. And I was hoping that you could just take a minute to talk about the effects of people stigmatizing these individuals or shaming or blaming. And it's easy to do given sometimes the turmoil that has been brought upon their families and loved ones. But is there any specific or unique factors of methamphetamine use disorder that makes that type of treatment maybe more adverse than we might expect?
Well, first of all, family members, I try not to make family members feel bad if they have shamed their loved ones at some point during their addiction, because it does not really helpful to make them feel worse about what's happening to their loved one. As professionals, though, and as people who are trying to lead our communities out of the problem, it is very important that we avoid shaming. Shaming becomes a negative emotional state that the person then wants to escape. And the way they've learned to escape negative emotional states is to use drugs. So without meaning to, you're potentially feeding that cycle by activating that extended amygdala and triggering their behavior pattern. Not that long ago, shame was kind of a standard treatment, a standard feature of how we tried to reprogram people's behavior, but it turns out to be very harmful. And that's why, for example, contingency management, is the opposite of that. It's little modest rewards for positive behavior, because we've learned that punishing undesirable behavior is not only not effective, but it kind of causes the opposite. It makes the situation worse. So we learned a little bit the hard way over time about what helps people with substance use disorder and what actually makes it worse. But it's important to try to teach families effective ways to interact with their loved one, but try not to make them feel bad. But as professionals, it's important that we hold ourselves to the standards that the evidence would indicate and not let our feelings of frustration about people's behavior influence our treatment and care of them.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, with that in mind, that the use of motivational interviewing in combination and prior to getting people into treatment is a research-based practice that has good efficacy for both dealing with treatment-resistant engagement, as well as in combination with cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, DBT. So there's a lot of research that would help you with the treatment-resistant individual who might be shame-based and have trouble accessing care.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Motivational interviewing, I feel like, is a skill set that everybody interacting in any capacity with people with substance use disorder could learn. I think even like one of my medical assistants was just a natural born motivational interviewer, and she was so effective. People would come to my practice to see me, and by the time I would get in there, I'd be like, oh, you don't need me anymore. Margie took care of you. And it's really powerful. But it's important to make sure that motivational interviewing is used correctly to identify things that the person is willing to work on and able to change. I've noticed that sometimes people get a little bit into this model where instead of motivational interviewing, it's more like cajoling or manipulating people into getting into treatment. And that's not the spirit of motivational interviewing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campopiano. We have a couple other questions. I know we're right at the end of our time. Do you have a moment for just 2 more questions?
Of course, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, these are good questions, so I'd love to address them. The first one is, are providers hesitant to treat meth-induced psychoses with medications like Seroquel? That's how you pronounce that?
No, they shouldn't be. If they are hesitant, it's going to be because,
They don't
maybe
know.
Yeah, they don't know, they haven't been trained, it's not their area of expertise. That's going to be more like it. Now, there's actually, good evidence that Seroquel in particular works well for methamphetamine-induced psychosis, and has fewer side effects than some of the other antipsychotics. But, if you're an ER doctor and your thing is trauma and heart attacks, you're not necessarily going to automatically be familiar and comfortable with what the latest evidence is for treating methamphetamine-induced psychosis. So that's where we can help providers get up to speed and feel like they're not like going out on a limb or out into an area that they're not necessarily comfortable with. The other thing is that I think healthcare professionals are starting to understand that addiction is a chronic condition. And so they get a little worried about kind of just throwing medication at something and sending that person back out in the world and not knowing what's going to happen to them, and knowing that they need more help than that. And it can be a little paralyzing for healthcare professionals because it's like they have a person in crisis and they're not sure what exactly the right thing is to do. And then they're only going to be interacting with this person in this little slice of time, and out they go back into the world. So there's a couple of things that you can potentially address to help providers in your community kind of get comfortable with what they can do and what the science says and what your community is doing to help patients when they're not in their ER or office or wherever they're seeing them.
Wonderful. I have one more that I would love to have you address. The question is there anything for us to understand for an infant affected, I assume, by stimulant use during pregnancy?
Well, we have not as carefully studied methamphetamine, prenatal methamphetamine exposure, but we did unfortunately learn a lot from the so-called crack epidemic. And we did learn that those substance exposed infants can go on to develop normally if they are provided with an enriched environment. And I don't mean rich, I mean the parents have enough support and there's educational resources and things like that for the child, and that after birth they need, quiet, dim environment, not a lot of lights and excited people around. So there are interventions you can do right away in terms of, quiet in the postpartum period, environmental enrichment, early services in the home that can help those children develop normally. We do know that growing up in a home where substances are being used is probably just as bad, if not worse, than prenatal exposure to substances. So it's natural to be concerned about the prenatal exposure because the whole brain is developing. But the childhood exposure to substance use and the trauma and instability in the home environment are probably a bigger source of concern. So enough time has gone by since the crack epidemic that we've been able to follow those substance exposed children into adulthood and have found that they have, for the most part, where their social environment has been able to be balanced, that they've developed pretty normally. We do have some incidents of stimulant exposed infants through medication prescribing, because stimulants are prescribed for ADHD and weight loss, and there are sometimes exposed pregnancies through that. That again, we haven't seen a big pattern in terms of this exposure causes this problem in life. So the focus of the intervention needs to be on making sure that family home environment is healthy for that substance exposed infant.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers and for this really informative session. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking time and extra time to answer these questions. And I want to thank everyone for your involvement and your interaction and for being here and learning. And yeah, this is a really wonderful session. Thank you so much, Dr. Campopiano, for sharing your education and knowledge with us. Yeah, and I want to thank Shirley again for starting us off with a blessing today, and Pam and Kathy and Ella, thank you so much for your support for this event. And with that, I think we've hit the end of our time today. And I just want to thank you all for being here and for being a part of this.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a great pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you all soon.